Hello listeners and welcome back to another episode of Radio Westeros, and this time it's all about Daenerys Targaryen. I'm Yolkboy, broadcasting from England, and with me is my co-host, Lady Gwyn.
Yeah, hi there listeners, I'm here in Boston, and before we get started, we just have some quick housekeeping today. This episode marks the 1-year anniversary of Radio Westeros, and we want to thank you listeners so much for all your support and for spreading the word.
Yeah, it's been a great year, and we're so glad to have you all on board. And one thing that we'd like to mention is that so far we've not been accepting any donations, but Lady Gwyn and I have growing debts and overheads, and so now we've put a PayPal link at our website, that's radiowesteros.com, just in case any of you feel like helping us out.
Yeah, and so thanks in advance if you're able to help out with keeping Radio Westeros going strong. And anyway, let's talk about Daenerys. We have a long and detailed episode today. First, we'll look at how her opening chapter gives us a grounding of her character and themes. Then we'll analyze her journey through the rest of Game of Thrones, where she rises from a commodity to the mother of dragons. We'll also assess Dany as a conqueror in Slaver's Bay and then a ruler in Meereen.
And plus, we'll do some theorising as we discuss where Dany's house with the red door might be. To break up the analysis a bit, we have readings from the Pyre and the Dracarys moment in Astapor. With a pseudo-advert, music from Karliene, and speculation about Dany's future, that will be the episode today, and we really hope that you will enjoy it. And we just have to say that there was so much to write about, we couldn't fit everything about Dany in. So we're going to leave our look at the stallion that mounts the world and the House of the Undying prophecies for a future prophecy episode. We just couldn't cram all those in, unfortunately. But anyway, let's get going with Daenerys Targaryen. A dragon is no slave.
Woman, is that meant to insult me? I would return the slap if I took you for a man. I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, the unburnt, mother of dragons, Khaleesi to Drogo's riders, and queen of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros.
So, to begin, we're going to look at Dany's first chapter in the Game of Thrones, to get a grounding of her as a character and see what themes were laid out by the author. After an icy prologue and northern POVs from Bran and Catelyn, we're taken across the narrow sea to Essos. It's in Illyrio's manse that we first get to meet Daenerys Targaryen.
And we quickly get the sense of Dany's situation. Her brother's dressing her up, and he seems to be ordering her quite firmly. Dany's humbled to see the dress and asks, "Is it mine?" hinting to her impoverished upbringing. She's forgotten what it's like to be a princess, which both underlines her status as a princess of some kind and the reality that she's so poor she has to rely on others.
And Dany soon shows that she's no fool by inquiring why Illyrio is being so generous, saying that he must want something. And this hints at her street smarts and skills at reading people. She might have gotten carried away with the dress and gems and feeling like a princess, as someone like Sansa could have, but instead we see realism and observational skills that serve her throughout her arc.
So we learn that Magister Illyrio is a well-networked, unscrupulous, and self-serving man who's dealt not only in spices but in things less savory. This is all gleaned by Dany's attention to talk in the streets, and instills more caution in her than in her big brother Viserys. This is also the first hint that she might be about to become one of those things less savory that Illyrio deals in, an allusion to the slave trade.
And with the sense that Viserys is slightly crazed and overpowering, the reader already has a grounding of a lost princess who, although born into great power, is utterly powerless in her situation. And she seems to be at the mercy of 2 dubious male characters who, in different ways, instill fear into her. Given Dany is both smart enough to read what's happening and politely passive, this fear, as well as some sympathy, is passed on to the reader.
Yes, Viserys has a feverish look in his lilac eyes, and we learn that he often has fits of aggression aimed at Dany, which he calls waking the dragon. This phrase later takes on a different meaning, of course, and it's important now that it's repeated to her. For now, it represents the power Viserys has over her and the fear those words can create. As he dresses her, he twists her nipple while threatening her. We can really see that Viserys is abusive, and the disempowerment that Dany must feel is one that shapes her through her future arc.
Yeah, and we'll be discussing how Dany moves from disempowerment to positions of power today. But it's in this early dressing scene that slaves are first mentioned. They are to bathe Dany. And as Viserys tells her this, he also barks orders at her and tells her that the Khal will be looking for, quote, a different sort of mount. So it's clear that, in some way, Dany herself is a lot like a slave, and she belongs to her brother's ambitions.
Yeah, and Viserys starts to show her affection while talking of what giving her over to a Khal will do for his power lust. It sounds like a complex but very damaging relationship the two have from Dany's point of view. What's clear is that she is a commodity, an object, and a means to an end, a pawn in the game. She has no power to change these frightening dynamics.
But next we see more themes introduced. First, that of a lost childhood. Dany hears ragged children on the streets playing. It says, for a moment she wished she could be out there with them, barefoot and breathless and dressed in tatters, with no past and no future and no feast to attend at Khal Drogo's manse.
And this highlights the fact that she's still half a child. We learn that she's bled and so is a woman in some sense, yet she's just 13 years old and wishes she could have a simple life, playing freely as the other children are. Being a princess in exile sounds like a position of privilege, but in reality she has the worst of two worlds.
Right, she's poor and disempowered, yet highly valuable as a commodity. Next, the notion of home comes into play. We already know that Illyrio is housing the siblings, but has ulterior motives, and so the manse can be no true home for her. And we learn that Viserys' notion of home is Westeros, a place where he spent some time in his youth before their father was killed and their family usurped.
However, Dany fled Dragonstone soon after her birth and only has her brother's stories to go on. It says, she had never seen this land her brother said was theirs, this realm beyond the sea, these places he talked of, Casterly Rock and the Eyrie, Highgarden and the Vale of Arryn, Dorne and the Isle of Faces. They were just words to her.
Exactly, Dany does go on to desire a seat on the Iron Throne, yet it doesn't carry with it the true sense of home. And we're talking about the place that you feel where you belonged, and that a lost child might pine for. The home Dany seems to pine for is in Braavos, a house with a red door that she remembers from her early life. And we'll be talking about where that house might be soon, but for now, it's really a symbol. There seems to have been a time in her life where she felt safe and wanted before she and Viserys had to leave, beginning a life of poverty, begging and humiliation. This house with the red door represents home to Dany, just as Westeros represents home to Viserys.
And after some backstory, where we learn of the former power of Dany's house, and following on from the notion of home, we start to think about the associated theme of family. Dany's father had his throat opened by the Kingslayer, and it says her mother died birthing her, and for that, quote, her brother Viserys had never forgiven her. So set against the strong sense of family we get from the early Stark chapters, Dany really seems to be alone.
Yeah, she's an orphan, and there's been no adult figure to take care of her for a number of years. There's fond memories of Willem Darry, who seems to have been very good to her in the Red Door days, but she lost him too, when he died of illness. This loss is closely tied to her loss of home, and with her parents and Willem absent, and with Illyrio being no kind of father figure at all she now has of home and family is Viserys. But she thinks, Yet now Viserys schemed to sell her to a stranger, a barbarian.
Okay, so again we arrive at slavery and human commodity, and by now Dany's dignified acceptance of her situation only heightens our sympathy for her. When we saw Dany being bathed by slaves, one of them mentioned that Drogo is so rich that even his slaves wear golden collars.
And later on we learn that the collars are in fact bronze, but Dany believing their gold is important. When being dressed, she is given a collar to wear, quote, a heavy golden torque emblazoned with ancient Valyrian glyphs.
Right, and Dany remembers what the slave girl had said about Drogo making his slaves wear golden collars. Dany's response to this recollection is to feel a sudden chill, and goose flesh pimpled her bare arms.
Yeah, so this is perhaps the moment reality really hits, and the sudden chill says it all. We have so far seen slaves with Dany, bathing and dressing her, and she didn't really think much about that either way. Yet now she's actually contemplating being a slave herself. We really see the roots of her anti-slavery theme that grows and grows through her arc, becoming one of her defining beliefs and policies. Although Dany's experience with Drogo turned out to be more empowering than she'd anticipated, which we'll discuss, this time here, fearing Drogo, Illyrio and Viserys, laid the groundwork for her shackle-breaking, emancipation and freeing of so many people with whom she can now relate. Dany's empathy towards slaves is born from the experience of fear, disempowerment, abuse and hopelessness that the shackled masses of Essos feel.
And we see our first Unsullied, named an insolent eunuch by Illyrio, and it's interesting rereading this to think about the effect Dany has on the slave trade later on, attempting to stop the supply of Unsullied to people like Illyrio, the man who arranged her own sale.
And it's also interesting that Illyrio talks about Jorah Mormont, a man exiled for trading slaves. Illyrio says of his crime, some trifling affront. He sold some poachers to a Tyroshi slaver instead of giving them to the Night's Watch. Absurd law. A man should be able to do as he likes with his own chattel.
Notice the word chattel. This is a term for property that isn't real estate, and it's linked to the word cattle. People are like cattle to the slavers, and perhaps most harrowingly for Daenerys, her brother, someone who should love and care for her, is willing to sell her off like cattle.
And it's curious that of the slavers Dany is now surrounded by, Jorah has this dark backstory, which adds further intrigue when she opposes slavery later on. It's clear that in certain parts of Essos, there's a fine line between slaver and slave, remembering that Jorah himself becomes a slave.
Okay, so as Dany's about to meet Drogo, we see how trapped she is and how she truly feels. It says, Dany wanted to run and hide, but her brother was looking at her, and if she displeased him, she knew she would wake the dragon. Anxiously, she turned and looked at the man Viserys hoped would ask to wed her before the night was done.
Yeah, and Viserys is also afraid, we learn. He is a nasty, selfish brother, but we do get a sense of a lost child wanting home that's actually quite similar to Dany. Viserys is desperate, and after trading in his mother's crown, he has nothing left to sell apart from his own sister. When Dany observes Drogo, a huge and intimidating man, we get this passage.
Dany looked at Khal Drogo. His face was hard and cruel, his eyes as cold and dark as onyx. Her brother hurt her sometimes, when she woke the dragon, but he did not frighten her the way this man frightened her. I don't want to be his queen, she heard herself say in a small, thin voice. Please, please, Viserys, I don't want to. I want to go home. Home! He kept his voice low, but she could hear the fury in his tone. How are we to go home, sweet sister? They took our home from us. He drew her into the shadows, out of sight, his fingers digging into her skin. How are we to go home? He repeated, meaning King's Landing and Dragonstone and all the realm they had lost. Dany had only meant their rooms in Illyrio's estate. No true home, surely, though all they had, but her brother did not want to hear that. There was no home there for him. Even the big house with the red door had not been home for him. His fingers dug hard into her arm, demanding an answer. "I don't know," she said at last, her voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes.
And then finally, Viserys confesses that he's so desperate to get an army to restore the Targaryen legacy that he would let a whole Khalasar and their horses fuck Daenerys. Trapped, frightened and lost, Dany obeys her brother's commands and stands up to greet the Khal, smiling.
So this is a very eventful first chapter for Dany. She comes across as a decent, normal, and observant, yet timid young girl, whose privileged royal background has brought enormous expectation and burden to her. She carries the weight of a fallen empire on her shoulders, and with a bullying and aggressive brother as her only semblance of kin and home, surrounded by powerful men wanting to use her in different ways, this 13-year-old girl is in a terrible situation.
Yes, she really is. It's worth noting that perhaps more than any other character, Daenerys finds ways to turn around her own plight, and manages to translate that into a force with which to initiate change. And next we'll be delving deeper into Dany's story in A Game of Thrones, after this.
And for the first time in hours, she forgot to be afraid. Or perhaps it was for the first time ever. A daring she had never known filled Daenerys then, and she gave the filly her head. The silver horse leapt the flames as if she had wings. The silver horse leapt the flames as if she had wings.
So, with Dany and her major themes having been introduced, let's next analyse her journey through A Game of Thrones, where we see her transform from commodity to mother of dragons, the early phases of what is a complex empowerment arc, and it's this arc that we're going to really focus on today. Okay, so leading up to Dany's wedding. Drogo calls his entire Khalasar together, 40,000 warriors plus followers. Remembering that Dany has had no family besides her horrible brother, she's clearly about to enter a different world in this sense.
Yeah, huge change awaits her, and quite understandably she doesn't anticipate any potential benefits of marrying into such a large family, if you can call it that, at this stage. The Khalasar must have been terrifying with its size, strange customs, and the creation of so much fear to the Pentoshi locals that they doubled their city guard.
And add to these anxieties Dany feels the continual intimidation from her brother with his willingness to trade her. Speaking of Viserys, he's already sowing seeds of his own downfall with his impatience and cultural insensitivity. Here's a passage. "The Khal has promised you a crown, and you shall have it," says Illyrio. "Yes, but when?" replies Viserys impatiently. And then Jorah says soon after that, "The Dothraki are true to their word, but they do things in their own time."
And as we know, the Dothraki were true to their word, and with Viserys' imperious attitude and saying things like, "I piss on Dothraki omens," not only do we get the sense that he's pretty stupid, but that Daenerys, as a quiet and thoughtful observer, will surely get along with Jorah and the Dothraki much better than he will.
Yeah, things already don't look great for Viserys, and then the beggar king proclaims, "The dragon never begs," which is quite laughable. And then we see Dany's first dragon dream. Viserys is hurting her, and this is a nightmare full of fear, mirroring her real life. He screams, "You woke the dragon," several times, and then she bleeds down her thigh, and there's a ripping sound and the cracking of a great fire. Viserys disappears, replaced by a dragon with molten eyes.
Okay, so dragon dreams can have prophetic qualities, and there's obvious shades of the dragon birth here, as well as her brother's death. But this woke the dragon line is touching something in Dany's psyche early on. She wakes in terror, this theme of fear being played with again. If Dany wants to initiate change, she must overcome the crippling fear that's frequently mentioned.
And Dany awakes to her wedding day. Again, we get more of this fear. The Dothraki seem, quote, strange and frightening, and at the feast she's surrounded by harsh and alien voices. She's lonely and isolated, as she has been her whole life really. Drogo is ignoring her, and it says there was no one to talk to.
However, now we get the first hint of a hidden strength in Dany, a resilience beneath the timidness. Too afraid to even eat, her internal monologue says, I am blood of the dragon. I am Daenerys Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, of the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror.
Yes, so we start to wonder if Dany does actually have some mettle now. And notice she internally draws upon her proud heritage to give her strength, something Viserys does externally and often to his detriment. But after witnessing death and animalistic sex during the wedding feast, again we see her fear.
Right, never a dull affair, those Dothraki weddings. And now she's seen the savage nature of the Dothraki. It says terror grew in her. She's afraid of the alien and monstrous Dothraki, afraid of failing Viserys, and most of all, afraid of consummating the marriage. She must be wondering if she's a sex slave at this point. But again, she finds strength by reminding herself of her dragon heritage.
However, just as it seemed like the fear was getting too much for Dany, from out of nowhere there's some pleasantness, and the first glimpse that her relationship with the Dothraki has the capacity to turn into something positive, wedding gifts.
Yeah, and there's no cutlery sets or coffee makers here. She gets 3 handmaidens, highly significant remembering the male-dominated world that she's found herself in. And then there's the Westerosi books from Jorah, and Illyrio hands over 3 dragon eggs. Dany's very impressed. They're the most beautiful things she's ever seen, but she knows in reality her sale to the Dothraki was facilitated by an exchange of slaves, and that Illyrio can well afford this gift.
Yes, so again we see how Dany can be quite astute, and whilst the dragon's eggs might be the most significant gift long term, it's Drogo's gift which most affects Dany here. A beautiful silver horse which took her breath away, and which Drogo says matches the silver of her hair, a little hint that he's capable of being more than just a monstrous brute. After noting that the horse is special, Dany nervously mounts a silver, and it says, for the first time in hours, she forgot to be afraid.
Yeah, so her silver represents autonomy, freedom, and as she rides, she has control of her own destiny for a while, something she must have truly craved after being with Viserys and being treated like a slave. Her fear is now under control, and while it's Drogo who gifted her the horse, it's Dany herself at the reins.
And she makes a silver jump over a fire pit, showing a spontaneous and daring side to her we wouldn't have guessed at. Something that we'll see again at crucial times from Dany. As it jumps, we're told it was as if the horse had wings, a nice nod to her mounting of Drogon later on, over a very different kind of pit.
And so, when Dany and Drogo consummate their marriage, thankfully it's not as terrifying as she'd anticipated. Again, he shows a tender side as she becomes aroused and says yes. But notice so far how Dany has this pendulum going on. She gets bouts of fear, which she then overcomes.
Yeah, it's like a roller coaster that continues right through her arc. It's like a pendulum of empowerment that swings back and forth. And talking of empowerment, we see this theme grow as the Khalasar enters the Dothraki Sea, a huge expanse of grassland. The openness of the surroundings mirrors the newfound sense of freedom we get from Dany.
And we learn of her initial discomfort in the saddle and, in spite of the apparent tenderness of their first night together, some disturbing sexual encounters with Drogo. But later we see her growing in confidence. She's starting to enjoy herself, even her sex life. It says she began to find pleasure even in her nights. And this surge in confidence, we learn, was triggered by her second dragon dream. A dragon covered her in fire, cleansed her. There was no fear. And it says, she felt strong and new and fierce.
Yeah, and every day after that dream it was easier. Even her handmaidens noticed the change in her. The dragon dream directly helped her, remembering that she's now got those eggs. So there's something going on with dragons and Dany's personality here, and this dream catalyzes her empowerment.
However, Viserys is still being a brat, and we get the sense that if Dany wants to obtain further freedom, she'll have to transcend his grasp. Viserys now stands in contrast to her. He's struggling with this way of life and isn't smart enough to comprehend the benefits that integrating into the Khalasar might bring. Dany tries not to let Viserys spoil the serenity of the Dothraki Sea.
Yeah, he's like the fly in her ointment at this stage, and we start to see that he might need her more than she needs him. She's empowering herself by adapting to her surroundings, assimilating and enjoying the journey. Viserys doesn't do any of this, which comes to a head when he aggressively confronts her. She shoves him, notably the first time she's ever defied him apparently, and then we get a crack of Jogo's whip.
And as Viserys lies on the ground, Dany thinks, he was a pitiful thing. He had always been a pitiful thing. Why had she never seen that before? There was a hollow place inside her where her fear had been.
Yeah, that fear of hers has gone. She is growing as a person. The power pendulum between the siblings has truly swung, and Dany orders her brother, the man who has owned and sold her, to walk behind the Khalasar. And she seeks further empowerment in her sex life too, now using her sexuality and femininity. She tells Drogo to have sex face to face rather than from behind, so in her own way begins to challenge Dothraki traditions and asserts herself. Soon after, we learn of her pregnancy.
Yes, a game-changing moment for Dany, with Drogo's child growing inside her. This immediately affects the dynamics even further. First of all, it makes Dany more vulnerable and gives cause to protect herself against Viserys. He soon grabs her arm and says, "You forget yourself, slut. Do you think that big belly will protect you if you wake the dragon?"
Bad move, Viserys. And thematically, Dany's sense of family is now growing. She's fitting in with the Dothraki, has her handmaidens for female companions, her Khals protecting her, and a Khal husband. In a short space of time, she's really come a long way. Ironically, as her brother's influence subsides, her sense of family and belonging has actually increased. Dany finding family in strangers is something that comes up through her arc, but now she has a child inside her. Her bonds to the Dothraki Khalasar are really strengthened, and she can look ahead to the family life she was denied in her own childhood.
And once again we're reminded of the role the dragon's eggs play. She holds them and it says, "They were so beautiful, and sometimes just being close to them made her feel stronger, braver, as if somehow she were drawing strength from the stone dragons locked inside." She was lying there holding the egg when she felt the child move inside her, as if he were reaching out, brother to brother, blood to blood. "You are the dragon," Dany whispered to him, "the true dragon. I know it. I know it."
Okay, and next we see Dany trying to eat that stallion's heart, which has been cut out using stone knives because standard blades aren't permitted in Vaes Dothrak. This ceremony not only echoes real-world sacred meal rituals, from pagan sacrifices to Christian Eucharist, but further highlights Dany's integration into Dothraki culture. And if she can finish it, the horse-mad Dothraki think that it's going to strengthen the child.
And so Dany does very well to eat the heart, and afterwards an old crone makes the stallion that mounts the world prophecy, and Dany names the child Rhaego. Dany is now an accepted and very important member of the Dothraki. Devouring the heart was a powerful moment and highlights her increased inner strength and outward power. However, there's further indication that Viserys is headed in the opposite direction.
Yeah, her brother goes to drink wine, with mentions of another petulant display, attacking a blood pie this time. Is that wise? Dany asks Jorah, and the reader suspects that it's most certainly not. Jorah also mentions he stopped Viserys stealing the dragon's eggs. The beggar king is becoming more and more isolated.
And then when Viserys rolls up, drunk and insulting his whore sister, she understands what his drawn sword will mean and that he's too culturally ignorant to see it. Although Dany has often despised and feared Viserys so far, she's also sympathized with and shown pity for him. This shows her capacity for empathy, which is a large part of who she is. However, when Viserys points the blade at her belly, we see this empathy vanish.
Yeah, it says, Viserys was weeping, she saw, weeping and laughing, both at the same time. This man who had once been her brother. So Viserys has actually lost his name to Dany now, and he's done something irreversible, unforgivable, and now we see how hard Dany can be.
Yeah, Kotho seizes Viserys, and she refuses to look away as he's crowned in molten gold. So Viserys is gone, who was so desperate for power that he sold his own sister. It's worth skipping to a quote in Storm to really appreciate how their relationship affects her later arc. It says, "I was alone for a long time, Jorah, all alone but for my brother. I was such a small, scared thing. Viserys should have protected me, but instead he hurt me and scared me worse. He shouldn't have done that. He wasn't just my brother. He was my king. Why did the gods make kings and queens, if not to protect the ones who can't protect themselves?"
We can see that Viserys' treatment of her was one of her main inspirations to conquer and rule, it seems. Now with Viserys gone, that fly in her ointment, she's finally rid of the fear he brought to her. Dynamics have changed dramatically, and with the prophecy in her mind, that the stallion will ride to the ends of the earth, Dany starts to crave Westeros. She realises her own importance as the last living Targaryen, carrying the family line in her belly. It says, "In her womb grew a son who would one day bestride the world." That should be enough for any woman, but not for the dragon. With Viserys gone, Daenerys was the last, the very last. She was the seed of kings and conquerors, and so too the child inside her. She must not forget.
And we soon see her desperation, reminiscent of Viserys's, as she begins to talk Drogo into a honeymoon in Westeros. She tells Jorah, "But he must ride west. Please, help me make him understand." So this theme of home is arising again, and as Jorah promises that's where they'll go, she thinks, home? The word made her feel sad. Sir Jorah had his bare island, but what was home to her? A few tales, names recited as solemnly as the words of a prayer, the fading memory of a red door. Was Vaes Dothrak to be her home forever? When she looked at the crones of the Dosh Karliene, was she looking into her future?
So, we've seen Dany integrate into the Dothraki, seen her empower herself in doing so, but here's a reminder she's still her own person and will never be a true Dothraki. She has ambitions that are growing wide now, and she doesn't want to spend her future retirement with the Dosh Karliene. She is a dragon, and conquering and power are what made House Targaryen what it was.
And Dany's Westerosi ambitions take an unexpected turn. After a wine cellar tries to kill her and Rhaego, Drogo is not happy to hear the news that Robert Baratheon wants his wife and son dead. He swears before the Mother of Mountains to ride wooden horses to Westeros, like no other Khal has done.
Yeah, again, we're seeing Dany's level of power take steps back and forward. And now she's really in a great place with regard to her Westerosi ambitions. It's worth mentioning that whilst waiting for Drogo, Dany decided to experiment with the eggs, putting them on a brazier. She wonders if it was madness doing so, or some strange wisdom buried in her blood. Although the experiment fails, Dany is now proactively trying to hatch the dragons, and it seems that some strange force or compulsion might be playing a role.
Yes, it does. And so far Dany has seen and been gifted with slaves, even been sold off like a slave, but has not really connected the two in a way that shows hatred for slavery. This all changes when she witnesses the aftermath of her Khalasar's battle against another Khalasar and the Lazarene. About the Lamb Men, it says, Dany pitied them. She remembered what terror felt like.
Yeah, Dany's been there herself. And then we have this passage. She wondered what the Lamb Men had thought when they first saw the dust of their horses from atop those cracked mud walls. Perhaps a few, the younger and more foolish who still believed that the gods heard the prayers of the desperate men, took it for deliverance. So Dany is really beginning to empathise with the Lazarene, who are now going to be slaves, and she tries to take on their point of view. Not only is this triggering her anti-slavery stance, something so central to her later on, but it's really showing her capacity to empathise with people, even those she knows little about. And it's all rooted in her having experienced similar trauma and fears.
And then Jorah tells her there are 10,000 captives and equates the slaves with ships for her invasion. She can see for herself that people fall into slavery, but soon the full horror of the price of her ambitions hits her. She wanted to cry, but she told herself that she must be strong. This is war. This is what it looks like. This is the price of the Iron Throne.
Yeah, some of Dany's realism creeping in there. And while this conversation is happening, she can hear the screams of a girl no older than herself called Eroa. And she's being raped over a pile of corpses. This is a real dilemma for Dany. Selling people into slavery is not only her ticket to Westeros, but part of her Khalasar's culture. Again and again, Dany will have to make decisions surrounding this issue, and now we see her take on the reins, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah, she clenches her silver's reins as she commands Jorah to make them stop. So Dany's being very brave here. Jorah and the Dothraki are perplexed, but she uses her position as Drogo's wife to stop the rape. And this is the Drogo that talks about rape as if it's a triumph. On one hand, she's willing to challenge traditions and initiate unthinkable change, yet she's still embracing the power of the Khalasar. It's clear she wants to do the right thing, but she also wants to have her cake and eat it too. George never makes it easy for his characters to do this, and the complexities we see when she tries to cause change here follow her whenever she tries to exert a positive influence throughout her arc.
Yeah, there always seems like there's a price to pay. And this time the complexities come courtesy of Mirri Maz Duur. Mirri thanks Dany as she's spared, but her involvement from now until the end of her life challenges Ned's remarks that mercy is never a mistake.
So, Drogo has an arrow in him, a wide cut, and a missing nipple. Dany sees that he needs treatment, and Mirri offers to help, as a god's wife healer. Dany goes against the Dothraki, and the Khal listens to her. Again, we're seeing that spontaneous and intuitive side to Dany in showing trust in Mirri, and perhaps some naivete too. Dany is convinced the woman is so indebted to her that she'll do no harm to the Khal who's just destroyed her village.
And after Drogo is patched up, we next see him riding uncomfortably on his mount, surrounded by blood flies. And we're told these flies target the dead and the dying. Drogo is in such a bad way, he can't even fight off the flies. His wound has festered. Mirri treated him with a poultice, giving strict instructions not to take it off and not to drink milk of the poppy or wine. Khal Drogo has both taken off the poultice and proceeded to drink poppy wine.
And the reader can't be sure if there was something up with the poultice, or if Drogo has brought about his own downfall by removing it. We think the poultice was fine, but she might have administered it knowing full well he'd take it off and doom himself, given his attitude toward medical treatment. Remember, he said, "I spit on pain and drink what I like." We also think she knew he should have been treated by knife and fire, as his blood riders suggested, as she even says later, "There's great healing magic in fire." In this way, perhaps she helped to take down Drogo whilst upholding her ideal of treating anyone in need.
And when a soft touch from Dany sends Drogo falling off his horse, we realise how much trouble they're both in. A Carl who can't ride is no Carl, and Drogo is dying. Without her Carl, she is nothing, and could have Rhaego torn from her body. At best she'll end up with the crones in Vaes Dothrak. We see the old fear come back to Dany, and she starts trembling.
Yeah, Dany has empowered herself, yet it's all come via Drogo. It says, Drogo had been more than her sun and stars. He had been the shield that kept her safe. So she's up the ladder, and then all of a sudden she's sliding right down again. There's often such a fine and fragile line between peace and chaos for Dany. Once more, her sense of fear is directly linked to disempowerment, and so fuels her desire for power through the story.
Yeah, having been on such a high with the Dothraki recently, Dany is turned upside down, and fearing for herself, her son, and her husband. She calls for Miri again, quite a desperate move, and thinks she had finally found a safe place, had finally tasted love and hope. She was finally going home. And now, to lose it all. So yeah, we can actually see how desperate she is there.
And it's Dany who suggests magic to Miri. Magic is playing an increasing role in her arc. Miri warns her that only death may pay for life. Perhaps another example of Miri being truthful and letting Dany make her own decision, whilst withholding certain information. She even lays out the rules that no one may enter the tent.
And so Drogo's stallion is slain. Dany wonders if this is the cost of blood magic, and Miri sings her spells. But the Dothraki forbid blood magic, and so fighting ensues, and after a shove, Dany's labour begins prematurely. Jorah takes her into the tent because he needs a midwife, and so Dany enters a tent she was ordered to stay clear of. And now we see another dragon dream.
Yeah, and this time it's a fever dream. She sees the red door and she walks towards it. She sees Drogo, Viserys, Rhaego, and Jorah tells her Rhaegar was the last dragon. She then seems to see Targaryen ancestors telling her to run toward the door, faster. It's then that a great knife of pain ripped down her back and she felt her skin tear open.
So, pain down her back and her skin tearing open. It seems to us that Dany's actually growing wings here, perhaps turning into a dragon or a harpy, because we later see that she flies. Humans becoming dragons is a popular fantasy trope, and some sphinxes in Essos are half human, half dragon, and there's also the harpy statues that are also somewhat similar. With all the hints at a deeper connection between Targaryens and dragons, from the malformed babies to the repetition of the phrase blood of the dragon, it's clear this human-stroke-dragon theme is one George likes to explore in different ways.
Anyway, when she reaches the red door, which is identified as home, behind it is Rhaegar in armor. Jorah whispers, "The last dragon." But when she opens the visor, it's actually Daenerys. So we interpret that as Dany realizing that Rhaegar isn't the last dragon, as Jorah says. The last dragon is in fact her. Behind the visor of the last dragon is her own face.
And that's the dream. But we should mention that as it's unfolding, the sentence, "You don't want to wake the dragon, do you?" is repeated 8 times. This is a threatening line from Viserys that's been swimming around her subconscious since very early on. In this fever dream, it begins to change when it's repeated. It starts off as, "You don't want to wake the dragon, do you?" And it ends up being, "Wake the dragon," and finally the dragon, as she realises the last dragon is herself and not Rhaegar.
So, Dany has some deep connection with those dragon eggs, and as we soon see, that connection is wondrous, magical, something perhaps beyond words. Her fever dream was so powerful, the first thing Dany cares for upon waking is those eggs. It says they were the only thing in the world that mattered, and she crawls for the eggs before thinking of Rhaego and Drogo.
And when she wakes for the third time, she's actually cradling an egg. She thinks all her fear was gone, burned away. So once again the eggs give Dany a strange strength and help her overcome tremendous fear. She seems to have bonded with these eggs somehow, and now that she's lost almost everything, they're perhaps all she's got left.
Yeah, and that bond only grows. Miri tells her she gave birth to a dead, dragon-esque baby, and Dany thinks, darkness, the terrible darkness sweeping up behind to devour her. If she looked back, she was lost. And the darkness, of course, is the fear that's plagued her, and the line, "If I look back, I am lost," is used here to strengthen herself and remind herself of the fear that she no longer wants to succumb to. The root of this motif comes from the fever dream, as she wasn't allowed to look back while chasing the red door. In the dream it said, she could not look behind her, must not look behind her.
Yeah, so that's where this line, "If I look back, I am lost," is rooted in. It's the fever dream. And so Dany realises the fear of her situation could swallow her, and she must not succumb to or dwell upon it if she wants to survive. And this line is repeated right through her arc to overcome fear at various times. But now it's the dragon eggs that are her new hope.
Yeah, and she starts to feel heat in them, and we can sense something's happened in her subconscious, that she's tapped into some greater knowledge somehow. And soon enough we see a funeral pyre being made for Drogo and his horse. She sadly had to suffocate her sun and stars when she realized that Miri's spell had not had the expected outcome, in spite of the great sacrifice it required. Miri is placed within, as are the eggs. Dany knows what she's going to do. She's acting largely out of impulse and intuition, although she does feel that Miri has taught her the rudiments of blood magic.
And Georges call this next scene a one-off miracle. Dany joins the horse, Miri, Drogo and the eggs in the pyre, and when the dust has settled, she's revealed unharmed and with 3 baby dragons. A really fantastic climax to a Game of Thrones, and we'll have a reading of that scene soon.
And the actual pyre itself brings up numerous questions. Are the eggs ancient and turned to stone, as Illyrio says, or are dragons' eggs always stone in their natural state? Based on analysis of all dragon egg descriptions, we think it might be the latter, which would make sense because they'd have to withstand great heat. Further, are the eggs not ancient, but actually from a more recent clutch? If so, how did Illyrio obtain them? And did Dany bonding with the eggs make them hatchable? Did the souls of Drogo, Rhaego, and Viserys enter the eggs, remembering Viserion with his molten gold eyes, if that's a hint?
So questions about the pyre, the eggs, and the truth about Illyrio? But there's even more questions. Were Miri's screams on the pyre actually a spell? This is something that readers have picked up on. It says her voice was ululating, and this word is used 3 times in game. Once when Dany hears spell singers at the Eastern Market, once when Miri performs her spell in the tent, and once here on the pyre, ululating. And we think we'll learn a lot more about Miri and her backstory when Dany meets Marwyn, who taught Miri the secrets of the body.
So, lots of questions remain about the pyre and the dragons. We don't have time to explore them further here, but once again we see this pendulum of power swinging for Dany. She went from being secure in Drogo's Khalasar to losing everything, to being the mother of dragons now with a devout following, potentially the most powerful woman in the world with those 3 dragons.
Yeah, and this was all in a very short space of time. So we can see in game how Dany rose from being a commodity, basically a slave, to ending up pulling off a miracle and once again empowering herself. And the dragon's eggs were a huge part of that. There was a kind of magical connection there, and now her sense of family has changed once again. The birth of her dragons was a real game changer and one that facilitated a further rise to first conqueror and then ruler, as we'll be exploring today. But before we go on, it's time for that reading we promised. Here's Daenerys Targaryen on the pyre.
She heard the screams of frightened horses, and the voices of the Dothraki raised in shouts of fear and terror, and Ser Jorah calling her name and cursing. "No," she wanted to shout to him, "no, my good knight, do not fear for me. The fire is mine. I am Daenerys Stormborn, daughter of dragons, bride of dragons, mother of dragons. Don't you see? Don't you see?" With a belch of flame and smoke that reached 30 feet into the sky, the pyre collapsed and came down around her. Unafraid, Dany stepped forward into the firestorm, calling to her children. The 3rd crack was as loud and sharp as the breaking of the world. When the fire died at last, and the ground became cool enough to walk upon, Ser Jorah Mormont found her amidst the ashes, surrounded by blackened logs and bits of glowing ember, and the burnt bones of man and woman and stallion. She was naked, covered with soot, her clothes turned to ash, her beautiful hair all crisped away, yet she was unhurt. The cream and gold dragon was suckling at her left breast, the green and bronze at the right. Her arms cradled them close. The black and scarlet beast was draped across her shoulders, its long, sinuous neck coiled under her chin. When it saw Jorah, it raised its head and looked at him with eyes as red as coals. Wordless, the knight fell to his knees. The men of her Khaz came up behind him. Jogo was the first to lay his arak at her feet. "Blood of my blood," he murmured, pushing his face to the smoking earth. "Blood of my blood," she heard Aggo echo. "Blood of my blood," Dracarys shouted. And after them came her handmaids, and then the others, all the Dothraki, men and women and children, and Dany had only to look at their eyes to know that they were hers now, today and tomorrow and forever, hers as they had never been Drogo's. As Daenerys Targaryen rose to her feet, her black hissed, pale smoke venting from its mouth and nostrils. The other 2 pulled away from her breasts and added their voices to the call, translucent wings unfolding and stirring the air. And for the first time in hundreds of years, the night came alive with the music of dragons.
So, that was how a Game of Thrones ends. Really dramatic and magical scene there. And now it's time for some theorising, and that house with the red door in Braavos.
So, throughout the books, Dany thinks of one place she was truly happy, and is identified as her notion of home. This is a big house with a red door in Braavos. And there's been much discussion about where this house actually is, and we think it's time to take a look at that.
Yeah, and it's a couple of years ago now, I posted a thread at Westeros.org that seemed to pick up on an apparent anomaly. And this launched 1,000 crackpots about the house with the red door. And I saw that on one hand there was a lemon tree outside this house in Braavos, but on the other hand there seemed to be no trees in Braavos. So what's the deal? And in the thread someone mentioned they had the observation first, so a shout to the others take ya for getting there first. But anyway, I'd noticed this one too, and I'd been thinking about this lemon tree mystery for a good while. I'd wondered if it meant Dany had a dodgy memory, or if the house wasn't actually in Braavos, and there was a really raging debate there. And fast forward a while later, and a YouTuber showed up in the thread, and then he took the idea to YouTube, where again it got well known and tinfoil production increased dramatically. There's many weird and wonderful conclusions people have come to about this lemon tree and house with the red door.
Yes, there are. Anyway, we think that posters in Yolkboy's original thread came up with a decent solution very early on. So let's take a look at the mystery and the evidence. Okay, so it's in Feast where we learn that there's a problem with trees in Braavos. They grow on the outlying islands, but not on Braavos itself. Here are some quotes. First, from Arya we get, "They have no trees," she realized. "Braavos is all stone, a grey city in a green sea." And then, from Sam's point of view, that was Braavos, devoid of grass and trees. And later, Gilly tells Sam, "In the forest they see all, but there are no trees here." And finally, again from Sam's point of view, trees did not grow on Braavos, save in the courts and gardens of the mighty.
Yes, so we can see the anomaly here. There seems to be no trees in Braavos, yet Dany remembers a lemon tree there. However, let's look at the last one of those quotes again. Trees did not grow on Braavos, save in the courts and gardens of the mighty. So, to put it another way, there are actually trees in Braavos, but only in the gardens of the mighty.
And as we learned in the Mercy chapter, the mighty are what the Braavosi call their elite class, people with money and power to do more or less as they please. So it was suggested by posters in the thread that the Sea Lord is the mightiest person in Braavos, and so the Sea Lord's palace, or somewhere close, should be a contender for the house with the red door.
And we think that the Sea Lord's palace and grounds makes a lot of sense. One of the first things we're ever told about a Sea Lord is that he's very rich and has a taste for exotic things. This is with Syrio, who notes the Sea Lord he served had a menagerie with zebras, giraffes, hippos, manticores, kangaroos, and terrible walking lizards with scythes for claws.
Yeah, we think that's probably some kind of exotic creature from a place like Sothorios. But you get the idea. Sirioth's Sea Lord had a very exotic zoo, and in a place where there's supposed to be no grass or trees, he maintains these animals. Some of them are vegetarian. A taste for the exotic with the means, riches, personnel, and power to keep them.
And in the House of the Undying, we see at the Red Door house, quote, great wooden beams and the carved animal faces that adorn them. So, animal carvings in a place with a menagerie would make a lot of sense. And it just so happens that Dany and Viserys were already part of a Sea Lord's scheming.
We learn in Dance that a secret marriage pact was signed to match Arianne Martell with Viserys. Here's the passage. "It's a secret pact," Dany said, "made in Braavos when I was just a little girl. Sir Willem Darry signed for us, the man who spirited my brother and myself away from Dragonstone before the usurper's men could take us. Prince Oberyn Martell signed for Dorne, with the Sea Lord of Braavos as witness." So, it seems Oberyn signed this while in exile, but more interestingly, it was signed by the Sea Lord of Braavos. And doesn't it make sense that the Sea Lord was harboring and hiding the Targaryen children? He signed the marriage pact, so he was already involved and taking big risks. And when Dany gets the marriage pact, she thinks, this was done in Braavos while we were living in the house with the red door.
Yes, so whether Dany suspects this or not, this pact could have been signed actually at the house with the red door, somewhere in or around the Sea Lord's palace. You'd think a marriage pact of an exiled prince might be signed where the prince was staying. They'd at least have to know where the prince was. And anyway, one day I was thinking about all the ways this Sea Lord idea fits with the Red Door. So I opened up the Braavos map in the official World Map Book. Pause this and take a look at it if you have that official map book, or else I'll describe Braavos. It has a ring of uninhabited green islands around. However, Braavos itself is grey all over. You can see it's exactly how it's described. There's almost no greenery or trees. But, crucially, the Sea Lord's palace has huge green gardens and buildings and animal cages. And most of all, it has an abundance of trees and bushes. The only place in Braavos with trees that I can see. This back garden is hidden away and would be the perfect place for harbouring wanted people. It's a kind of island in itself, and again, there are trees in Braavos, just ask the Sea Lord.
So I think Dany remembers perfume smells, and perfume is obviously worn by rich people. And we have the animal carvings and the menagerie, the marriage pact connection, and also the map book given a huge, enormous, secluded garden with grass and lots of trees. But what about that troublesome lemon tree?
Well, the solution for this apparent anomaly could in fact be very simple, after the 1,000 Lemonati tinfoil crackpots about this. It's clearly stated several times that lemons are grown in Dorne, perhaps exclusively so in universe. Here's an example from Shanna in the Riverlands when Anguy asked for lemons. Lemons? And where would we get lemons? Does this look like Dorne to you?
So if the Sea Lord's signing a secret marriage pact, and he has ridiculously exotic gardens and money enough to keep and feed hippos and giraffes and so on, what could be sent from Dorne as an exotic gift and a symbol of alliance and solidarity? We think a lemon tree would be perfect.
Yeah, we do. And okay, so Dany sees a lemon tree as a symbol of innocence, but perhaps it might have represented some serious politics and scheming. And to the mentions of there being no trees in Braavos, this can be simply explained by the limitations of the POV chapters.
Yeah, exactly. They haven't seen any lemons or trees. But the Sea Lord's garden does have trees, hidden away as shown in the map, and stated in that quote, like we said, trees did not grow on Braavos, save in the courts and gardens of the mighty. So rather than being a clue that Dany's memories were of a different place, we think that the posters in Yolkboy's thread might have nailed it. The lemon tree really narrows down where in Braavos Dany actually lived. The lemon tree is a device to lead us to the one place in Braavos it could have been, and all signs point to the mighty Sea Lord's palace. And there do seem to be buildings out back in his menagerie on that map. The quotes about there being no trees or citrus come from characters who've obviously not seen the gardens of the mighty.
Also, Doran has a great motive to keep the usurped children in exile. Regarding the letter about the marriage pact, Barristan says, if Robert had known of this, he would have smashed Sunspear as he once smashed Pike, and claimed the heads of Prince Doran and the Red Viper, and like as not, the head of his Dornish princess too.
Yeah, so he wouldn't have risked keeping Dany and Viserys in Dorne. One word, and Robert could have had Arianne's head. Okay, so then the Red Door is shut on the siblings. Dany remembers it as being a simple life, but a safe one. And then they're thrown out and left to fend for themselves.
Well, it says, after Sir Willem had died, the servants had stole what little money they had left, and soon after they had been put out of the big house. So despite Dany thinking this is a simple life, the servants again point to a rich house. This simple life might have been in fact quite blessed. So then Sir Willem dies, but perhaps the Sea Lord did too. And we know when a Sea Lord dies, there's fighting, and eventually you do get a new Sea Lord, and a new First Sword is chosen too. So if Sir Willem and then the Sea Lord both died, we can see why Dany and Viserys would have to leave, because a new Sea Lord means a new regime.
Yeah, this would explain why the Red Door was shut for good. And one very interesting possibility in all this is that perhaps Dany and Syrio met. Maybe he helped the children find safe passage if the Sea Lord did indeed die, similar to what he did with Arya in her escape from King's Landing. If he was First Sword at that time, he would have had to leave too, as his tenure would end upon the Sea Lord's death.
Yes, so some interesting possibilities. And anyway, that's where we think the house with the red door was. And we don't think it's unlikely that the man who oversaw the Targaryen marriage pact was also harbouring the said Targaryen.
Okay, and next we'll be analysing Dany as a conqueror. But first, here's 2 advertisements. One from Astapor and the second from another A Song of Ice and Fire podcast.
The good masters of Astapor invite you to visit our Red Pyramid. We offer for sale the famous Unsullied Warrior. Their rigorous training is designed so that no duty required of them will ever be as hard. They are the lockstep legions of Ordgis come again, absolutely obedient, absolutely loyal, and utterly without fear. Our visitors can see 3 young boys confront a hungry bear. One boy is rolled in honey, one in blood, and one in rotting fish. You are encouraged to wager on which the bear will eat first. Enjoy the wonders of our beautiful Red City, where speaking High Valyrian is definitely not required.
Hi, I'm Aziz.
And I'm Ashaya. We're History of Westeros, a podcast dedicated to George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as HBO's Game of Thrones.
That's right. We cover the show, the spoiler chapters, the novellas, the maps.
But our specialty is the history and backstory.
Quite often, the history of A Song of Ice and Fire predicts its future, so by looking at the past, we can often tell what's coming.
Hey Aziz, you know the young king who rode south at the head of a large army, who never lost a battle and made several political blunders? He didn't leave an heir of his body and was murdered alongside some of his staunchest companions in an act of treachery that offended gods and man alike.
Oh, well, Robb Stark, the young wolf, of course.
Not the young wolf, the young dragon, King Daeron the First.
Oh, wow. Ashaya, you know that guy from the major family that some characters think slept with his sister, which caused people to question the legitimacy of the king and led to civil war? The one who was a teenager when he joined the Kingsguard and rose to become Lord Commander. The one whose mother died when he was really young. The one whose father was a hard man that became hand to the king at a really young age.
Obviously you're talking about Jaime Lannister.
No, actually. Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight. Just as the young dragon's fate parallels the young wolf's, the Dragon Knight's fate may parallel Jaime's.
To hear more about the fate of the Dragon Knight or Jaime Lannister,
or young wolves, dragons, and animals of all ages,
look for Westeros History on YouTube,
History of Westeros on iTunes or SoundCloud,
and historyofwesteros.com.
So, an advert from Astapor, and then that was History of Westeros podcast with a great advertisement of their own. History of Westeros are an excellent podcast. Many of you may know them, but if you haven't checked them out, we really recommend doing so.
Yeah, and we were guests on their video and podcast episodes for the Game of Thrones Season 5 reviews, so you can see our podcasts working together if you want to check those out. Aziz and Ashaya are very professional and good friends of ours too. It's worth mentioning if you checked them out a long time ago, they are now much improved in every way, so it might be time to revisit.
So, thanks to History of Westeros for the advert, and now moving on, let's discuss Dany the Conqueror. After being amidst battle on the Dothraki Sea, Dany gets perhaps her first taste of conquering in the House of the Undying, when Drogon unleashes his flame to save her. Later, Jiqui attaches a Dothraki victory bell to her hair, and despite being smart enough to accept the honor, Dany notes, "I have won no victories."
Yeah, this was Drogon's doing, yet Dany at least has both a taste of victory and witnesses firsthand the power of Dragonflame. In this sense, the destruction of the Undying was a coming of age for both Dany and Drogon.
And this lays down the foundations for Dany to become a conqueror. Now, conquering is something closely tied to her family and lineage, dating back to Aegon the Conqueror, who united Westeros, made himself king of the Seven Kingdoms, and had the Iron Throne built of the swords of the defeated. All possible because of Dragonflame. He was essentially a foreigner in a land with no dragons, so there are points of comparison, especially when considering that Dany might one day invade Westeros with 3 dragons herself.
However, it was in Astapor that Dany really started conquering. So let's assess her motives, strategies and abilities as a conqueror as Dany turns Slaver's Bay upside down. Okay, so it's Jorah who actually talks Dany into the trip to Slaver's Bay, telling the story of Qohor and the Unsullied. At this point, Dany is not keen on the slave trade. It says Dany was not certain she liked the sound of that at all. Everything she'd heard of the flesh marts in the great slave cities of Yunkai, Meereen and Astapor was dire and frightening.
But still she isn't fiercely anti-slavery. She's being advised by Jorah, a convicted slaver, and she's excited by the idea of buying Unsullied with Illyrio's trade items. So she's wary of slavery, but remember she's been around slaves with the Dothraki, and at this point she's not thinking of herself as a liberator. However, her relationship with slavery is already complex. It's not black and white, and remember she tried to, in some way at least, liberate those Lazarene women.
Exactly, and she also liberated people from the Khalasar before walking into the fire. Here's the quote. "You will be my Khalasar," she told them. "I see the faces of slaves. I free you. Take off your collars. Go if you wish. No one shall harm you. If you stay, it will be as brothers and sisters, husbands and wives."
So, with Dany, who still has some naivete you'd expect from a young girl, about to enter the cruel heartland of the slave trade, we sense she isn't going to like what she sees. But in fact, it's what she hears that first offends her, with Kraznys calling her a Westerosi whore, thinking that she won't understand the Valyrian tongue.
And then we get to hear how the Unsullied are made. Children are taken at age 5 and undergo a truly horrific training regime that involves being castrated, forced to kill a puppy, and then later made to kill a baby in front of its mother's eyes. The true horror and reality of the slave trade is now apparent. Remember that Dany relates to those who end up in slavery as children. She later says, "Do you know what it is like to be sold, Squire? I do. My brother sold me to Khal Drogo for the promise of a golden crown. Well, Drogo crowned him in gold, though not as he had wished, and I, my sun and stars, made a queen of me. But if he had been a different man, it might have been much otherwise. Do you think I have forgotten how it felt to be afraid?"
After hearing about murdering children, despite keeping up a front, Dany feels faint, and we can sense her disgust. When she asks if the Unsullied would betray her if some enemy of mine should offer them freedom, we see perhaps the first hint that liberating them has crossed her mind. Her inquiries about Unsullied behavior serve her well when she later turns them on Kraznys.
And despite knowing what he's going to say, she asks Barristan if she should buy them, and he replies that a slave army in Westeros is a terrible idea. "Yet I must have some army," is her response, and so we really see her dilemma. She needs an army. They must not be slaves, yet the best option is the Unsullied. She must have them all, yet has no coin. And she deplores the slave masters, yet they have the army.
So she has to come up with a plan that resolves all of these problems. And in conversation with Jorah, she learns 2 important things. First, that the slave trade revolves around Slaver's Bay. If there were no slavers there, there'd be nobody for the Dothraki and so on to sell slaves to, at least not significantly. And Jorah also tells her that Rhaegar fought his battles with honor and still died for it.
So now Dany is thinking about Slaver's Bay as a huge cog in the slavery machine, and also is reminded that fighting with honour got her brother Rhaegar killed. So perhaps being treacherous can sometimes get you what you want. So she formulates her plan, And now it's time to see Dany the Conqueror in action.
Okay, so first Dany plays on the greed of the slavers. They resist her wish for all the Unsullied plus the trainees, but there are hints to a greedy excitement among the masters. Then she offers Drogon. The key thing here is that Dany insists on every last Unsullied. She knows that leaves the masters completely vulnerable, but in their greed, they don't realize that.
And Dany knows as a vital part of the slave trade, they don't expect to be attacked, or else nobody could sell them slaves, something that she's learnt. So she's taking advantage of the very limited information that she's been given. She even recalls Giscari history, so she's being very smart here. She thinks, the Giscari lust for dragons, how could they not? 5 times had old Gis contended with Valyria when the world was young, and 5 times gone down to bleak defeat. For the freehold had dragons, and the empire had none.
Then comes the day of the trade, and Dany has even lied about her plans to all of her people, an excellent move which ensures the element of surprise is maximized. When she's handed over Drogon and gets the whip in return, it's time for one of the most exciting moments in the books. She makes sure the Unsullied are aware that they are now hers. As Missandei has already told her, they will simply obey without question.
And Kraznys gets a fitting taste of the slaver's whip as she tears his face open with the sharp claws and informs the masters that a dragon is no slave. She calls out to Drogon, and once again it's noted her dragon removes her sense of fear. And then, Dracarys.
Dracarys! Dragonfire! Drogon lights up Kraznys, his eyes melt, and Dany orders her Unsullied to kill the masters. Astapor, Drogon, and a huge army are now hers. It was an excellent plan, brave, treacherous, but executed to perfection. She resolves all the aforementioned problems in one go, and the only remaining problem concerns the fact that she now has slaves.
Yeah, and as Barristan had pointed out, slaves are really bad for her hopes of Westeros, and also bad for her conscience. So, she frees them. This is similar to when she freed slaves before stepping onto the pyre, and once again she shows that loyalty can be inspired in many different ways, not just by force and fear. The Unsullied stick with Dany without the need for a slaver's whip.
So, in taking Astapor, Dany shows tactical acumen, cunning, problem-solving skills, and bravery. She knows her own strengths and her foes' weaknesses, and she uses every piece of information at her disposal to get the end results she wants. She doesn't have time to make a thorough plan. Instead, she again shows her adeptness at acting on intuition and spontaneity. However, conquering Astapor was just phase 1 of her plan.
Yeah, now Dany has a huge army and realises that if she's to smash the slave trade, she must next take Yunkai. She also knows she must go for Meereen after that. So when she's outside of Yunkai, there's hints that one of her prime objectives is to take the city without shedding too much blood. She needs to take care of her own forces, she needs to bolster her troops with people she can take off the Yunkai as well. And finally, she needs cavalry, as her own army is lacking.
So, Dany's first smart move is with her tiny contingent of Dothraki. They are her only cavalry, and not all are of outstanding fighting ability, so she makes her Blood Riders her Khos as well. Khos are like Dothraki generals. She's giving up some of her personal protection in order to organize, mobilize, and make the best use of her Dothraki.
So now her Dothraki can be a scouting force, and so this small band of men now provides valuable information and will also be used to neutralize enemy scouts later on. So next Dany sees her foe, some half-trained Yunkai soldiers flanked by 2 sellsword cavalry companies, and it says, she'd ridden too long with Dothraki not to have a healthy respect for what mounted warriors could do to foot. The Unsullied could withstand their charge, but my freedmen will be slaughtered.
So Dany draws on experience, knowing the value of cavalry. But she also knows the fickleness of sellswords, and again shows quick wits, inviting the sellsword leaders to meet her 2 hours apart. She knows they'll come to see the dragons and to assess her, so she shows a fine ability to evaluate people. She understands motives, and in this sense is wise beyond her years.
Another move Dany has made is to challenge the Unsullied to start thinking for themselves. It might be safer to keep them running like machines, but Dany sees the potential, both as a humanist and as a military strategist, in capitalising on the freedom that she's granted them.
And she gives them autonomy at first by telling them to choose their own leaders and their own names, so democracy and identity are the devices she's using. Their elected general, Grey Worm, is apparently quick to learn and seems very loyal, so there might be a payoff for Dany's approach. Here's a quote. "If battle is joined, let Grey Worm show wisdom as well as valor," Dany told him. "Spare any slave who runs or throws down his weapon. The fewer slain, the more remain to join us after." "This one will remember," he replied.
Yeah, so Dany's showing some faith in the independence of the Unsullied. And when she meets the 3 leaders of the Stormcrows, she knows that she can take Yunkai by force, and perhaps a lesser conqueror might just have steamed right in. But, as we said, she wants those cavalry for the bigger picture, and also wants to minimise bloodshed. Her treachery in Astapor is noted by Prendal, a Giscari man, and this is one example of how her methods in Astapor might actually come back to haunt her.
And yet Dany invites the Stormcrows to turn cloak, using promises of gold and the threat of death, 2 things known to sway sellswords. After refusing, a glance from the handsome Daario Naharis as they leave reminds us that Dany has another attractive facet, her beauty.
Yes, she does. And 2 hours later, and Dany presumably timed it like this to create a degree of paranoia between the 2 sellsword factions, and she meets Miro of the Second Sons. She uses knowledge of history when she says, "The Second Sons have faced worse odds and run, at Qohor when the 3,000 made their stand." Miro doesn't budge and is really offensive. And now we see a masterstroke from Dany. She gives him a wagon of wine, and she's outsmarted Miro here. He thinks it's a tribute, but Dany knows he will likely be drunk when she chooses to attack now.
And last comes the Yunkai envoy, who tries to pay her off. Dany makes it clear that she not only wants to liberate the slaves, but will plunder all the gold anyway. She gives him 3 days to meet terms she knows he'll never meet, and has given the sellswords only a day to respond. And as the Yunkish envoy leaves, Dany reveals her plan to attack that very night. Again, there's an element of treachery, or at least trickery, but Dany knows the value of a surprise attack.
So, the Dothraki coast arranged the killing of enemy scouts, essential if they're to catch the foe unaware. When Dany herself proposes a 3-pronged attack, the reactions of Jorah and Barristan, 2 really seasoned warriors, let us know that Dany's military acumen is far beyond her years.
And the assault actually turns into a 4-pronged attack when Daario Naharis returns to her, having killed the other Stormcrow leaders and turned cloak. Dany orders the Stormcrows to take the Yunkai in the rear, and puts her faith in Daario.
And when news of the battle reaches Dany, we see once again all of her objectives have been accomplished. It's a quite amazing victory in this sense. She lost just 12 of her own men, whilst 200 Yunkai were killed. Maximum result, minimum bloodshed, just as she wanted. The Stormcrows turned, and the Second Sons were drunk on her wine, and so stayed out of the battle entirely, and they yielded. And so the conquering of Yunkai was a huge resounding success for Dany.
Yeah, it was an overwhelming victory, and of course this chapter ends with the liberation of thousands of slaves who all scream, "Mother." So she's a mother of dragons, a mother of liberated peoples, and this scene fulfills one of the House of the Undying prophecies.
Right, and again we see Dany finding family in strangers. And after the liberation of Yunkai, there's a third and final slaver city in the bay that she has her eye on. She knows if she takes Meereen, the slave trade will be on its knees. However, she now has an entourage of around 80,000 people, less than a quarter of whom are actually soldiers. And unlike Astapor, Meereen knew what was coming.
So they harvested, burnt the fields, and poisoned the wells. The message is clear. Dany must take this well-fortified city quickly or risk mass starvation, an early clue that liberation can cause problems. The Meereenese champion, Osnak Zopal, taunts Dany's troops, emboldening those behind the city walls. Again, Dany must act quickly and with success if she wants to keep morale high.
Yeah, and the first big decision is who to send up against Osnak. Dany chooses strong Belwas, which was a big surprise to her inner circle, and here's her explanation. Strong Belwas was a slave here in the fighting pits. If this highborn Osnak should fall to such, the great masters will be shamed, while if he wins, well, it is a poor victory for one so noble, one that Meereen can take no pride in.
So this was a great choice. No matter if Belwas won or lost, it was very smart. And Dany also thinks to herself that Belwas is relatively disposable, as he didn't lead other men. So she thinks quickly, is sure of herself, and again displays problem-solving abilities. She's set up a battle where she can't lose.
Yeah, it's already a great choice, but it actually turns out to be inspired, as Belwas evades Osnak's lance and goes on to kill him quite easily. A blow for the morale of the besieged city, especially considering Belwas shat in their general direction.
Okay, maybe a little nod to Monty Python there. And so Dany finds herself in a difficult situation. Meereen has solid walls, excellent defenses, and they've ensured there's no wood for siege weapons. Her 3 ships aren't enough for a maritime attack. Dany's people will soon go hungry, and there's already cases of disease.
So things could get very bleak for Dany here, but fortunately she gets a lucky break. She's counselled to go to Westeros or seek other foe. But then Brown Ben Plum, who's now in charge of the Second Sons, mentions the sewers. He'd once escaped Meereen via the sewers, and so knows they're a way past the big city walls. Now that Barristan and Jorah have revealed their traitor statuses, they're the men chosen to lead the disgusting attack, along with Belwas and 20 others.
And so the sewer rats set off, and Dany embarks on an ambitious 2-pronged attack. The sewer rats will create a slave uprising from within the city, while her main forces attack the gates, providing both a distraction and a fighting front. And with no siege weapons and no wood, Dany comes up with an ingenious plan.
Yeah, she takes apart her 3 ships, and using the metal figureheads as ram heads, makes rams out of the masts, one of which was called Joso's Cock, after the ship it was taken from. The ship's hulls are also torn up to make more siege weapons. In a way, this shows excellent resourcefulness, as the ships were her only source of wood. But it also recalls the Rhoynar Queen Nymeria, who burned her fleet of ships upon the shores of Dawn, symbolising that there was no looking back, which parallels closely one of Dany's major themes. If I look back, I am lost.
And so, once again, Dany's plan worked. The eastern gate of Meereen was breached, although there was lots of bloodshed this time. But victory was won when the sewer rats struck the chains off the fighting pit slaves, triggering the internal uprising Dany had hoped for. The last resistance was crushed by the Unsullied, and so Dany is now blooded conqueror. It says, "No one was calling her Daenerys the Conqueror yet, but perhaps they would. Aegon the Conqueror had won Westeros with 3 dragons, but she had taken Meereen with sewer rats and a wooden cock in less than a day."
Yes, so after starting out with almost nothing, Dany conquered 3 cities in Slavers Bay. She showed many great qualities you'd expect from a conqueror, from resourcefulness to tactical acumen to leadership skills. She liberated thousands of suffering slaves, brought freedom to the area, and turned a vile culture on its head. Dany conquered in a way that upheld her personal values and inspired the loyalty of people by love and not fear.
Right, and for all these reasons we can see why Dany is such a popular character. What a rise she's had since the days with Viserys. The pendulum of power has well and truly swung her way. But perhaps so far, her most significant conquering is of the fear and terror she felt early on, back when she was just a commodity to be traded.
However, the assessment of Dany as a conqueror actually grows more and more complex as she decides to stay in Meereen and rule, where we get to see the aftermath of her actions, methods, and conquest. Now her arc moves into a phase of leadership, so next we'll look at Dany as a ruler. But first, let's stay on the topic of conquering just for a minute. Here's a reading of everyone's favourite moment from Astapor. It's time for some dragon flame.
It is done, Kraznys agreed, giving the chain a sharp pull to bring Drogon down from the litter. Dany mounted her silver. She could feel her heart thumping in her chest. She felt desperately afraid. Was this what my brother would have done? She wondered if Prince Rhaegar had been this anxious when he saw the usurper's host formed up across the Trident with all their banners floating on the wind. She stood in her stirrups and raised the harpy's fingers above her head for all the Unsullied to see. "It is done!" she cried at the top of her lungs. "You are mine!" She gave the mare her heels and galloped along the first rank, holding the fingers high. "You are the dragons now! You are bought and paid for. It is done. It is done." She glimpsed old Grazdan turn his grey head sharply. He hears me speak Valyrian. The other slavers were not listening. They crowded around Kraznys and the dragon, shouting advice. Though the Astapori yanked and tugged, Drogon would not budge off the litter. Smoke rose grey from his open jaws, and his long neck curled and straightened as he snapped the slaver's face. It is time to cross the Trident, Dany thought, as she wheeled and rode her silver back. Her blood riders moved in close around her. "You are in difficulty," she observed. "He will not come," Kraznys said. "There is a reason. A dragon is no slave." And Dany swept the lash down as hard as she could across the slaver's face. Kraznys screamed and staggered back, the blood running red down his cheeks into his perfumed beard. The harpy's fingers had torn his features half to pieces with one slash, but she did not pause to contemplate the ruin. "Drogon!" she sang out loudly, sweetly, all her fear forgotten. "Dracarys!"
Okay, that was Dany conquering Astapor, and that didn't go so well for Kraznys. A perfect example of the excitement that Dany can bring to the story. And as we learned, she took the 3 cities of Slavers Bay with great haste. So, now let's consider Dany as a ruler.
Yeah, so with the slave trade now on its knees in Slavers Bay, Dany decided to stay and rule. This is a decision she took after leaving Astapor in the hands of a healer, a scholar, and a priest. The Chosen Three allegedly schemed to return power to the Masters, and so a butcher named Cleon slaughtered them and declared himself king.
And so already we see the lasting effects of Dany's conquering style. She thinks, "All my victories turn to dross in my hands. Whatever I do, all I make is death and horror." And Cleon is not only making plans against Yunkai, but has taken highborn boys to make new Unsullied.
So when considering what to do with Meereen, she realizes she can't let the city turn into another Astapor, and so decides to be its queen and rule. This is a new test for Dany, where we can not only further assess her leadership skills, but actually reassess her conquering exploits as well.
And Dany faces many problems as ruler of Meereen. These Dance with Dragons chapters are full of dilemmas. We'll show that they are almost all interlinked. We've seen Dany grow as a leader of people since those early days as she grasped power in Drogo's Khalasar. She led people through the Red Waste and experienced loss there, and her conquering showed flashes of brilliant leadership strategy. However, Meereen is the first time Dany has ruled over a massive population, and if she's going to one day rule Westeros, she needs to learn here. Sadly for her, things don't go well from the offset.
No, they don't. And we're going to identify the problems Dany faces so that we can explore their roots and her policies. She has to deal with the Sons of the Harpy, uniting Meereen, slavery, her dragons, food, trade, disease, Astapor, Yunkai, and preparing to go to Westeros. So that's 10 huge problems on her plate as she tries to continue to change the culture in Slaver's Bay.
Yeah, and so many problems are right off the bat. It's no wonder that she has a tough time. First of all, let's look at the Sons of the Harpy. This is a shadow organisation who murder her people. They seem to be intent on restoring Meereenese traditions to the city and represent the continued threat of an uprising by the conquered masters.
And the Sons have an increasing role in the story, with both their effects on Dany as a person and in shaping her policies. She thinks, I'm still at war, only now I'm fighting shadows. So when she learns that 9 murders have occurred in a single night, Dany is at a loss how to deal with it. Learning that Missandei's brother, Massador, was murdered, she hands a wine cellar over for questioning to the Shavepate. 2 Unsullied have been poisoned in his shop, so he's a suspect. Yet Dany notes that he might be innocent, so he should be questioned sweetly. She's being rational here, in spite of her anger.
However, Dany is then informed that a harpist was one of those murdered. And finally Dany snaps. The Shavepate can now not only question the wine cellar sharply, i.e. torture him, but he can do the same to his daughters. Dany didn't even check the ages of the daughters. They might even be children. So Dany went from arguing that the wine cellar could be innocent to sanctioning the torture of him and his daughters, all in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, Dany is reacting out of anger. She has these 2 sides to her personality. She can be so empathetic, but also very aggressive. And it's the mix of the 2 in her personality which make her such an interesting character. We wonder if the connection of the harpist to her brother Rhaegar, who is also a harpist, might have had some effect here. In any case, we can see here that as a ruler, her aggressive side can betray her empathetic side in going against her core moral principles.
And Dany must be afraid to leave the city and help Astapor, which really needs help, at least in part, because she fears what the Sons could do if she left the city with her troops. So we see for the first time how Dany is in a dilemma. She is trapped.
Okay, and let's look at Astapor, another huge problem. Dany has really upset the balance of power in the whole region. Not only is there internal conflict, but she now has enemies all around. Astapor became a slaver city again as soon as her back was turned. The city's class system was spun on its head, with the masters and slavers simply changing places.
So Astapor is aggressive towards Yunkai, and now has a war to deal with. Dany can't come to the rescue, as she later notes, if I had marched to Astapor, I would have lost Meereen. The Astapori suffer tremendously. There's starvation, cannibalism, and the outbreak of disease. With Astapor brought low, Yunkai now becomes a threat to Meereen, as it means they can march to her without Astapori interference. And this is really the start of the Battle of Fire, which we covered in the last episode.
Right, and remember that disease was driven north by the Yunkai, leading to the arrival of the Pale Mare outside of Meereen's gates. It's a horrible chain reaction. One problem feeds another. As the diseased Astapori starve outside her walls, and Yunkai teams up with other factions and places she's inadvertently upset, such as Tolos and Mentaris, Dany experiences firsthand the horror created as a result of her sacking of Astapor.
Yeah, and Dany says she gave these people freedom, which is true. However, and this is something last episode's guest Brynden Beefish has mentioned, Dany didn't leave a portion of her force in Astapor to defend the new regime she installed. It was naive to think such a quick change in culture was possible without the assistance of a solid force. As an Astapori petitioner tells her, "You gave us death, not freedom."
And not only that, but Dany didn't really overthrow Yunkai properly. It's no surprise that they've regrouped and now oppose her. It says, she was coming to regret leaving the Yellow City untaken after defeating its army in the field.
So again, we see that the roots to Dany's problems really lie with the manner in which she conquered. It's sometimes said that Dany is a better conqueror than ruler. But on closer inspection, we're beginning to see that the two are inextricably linked, and that the seeds of her current dilemmas grow from her conquering phase.
Okay, so huge problems with Astapor and Yunkai, atrocities, and the threat of a large-scale war with a city that had not long ago bent the knee. Now let's look at yet more problems from the list of 10 we gave. Another huge one is trade. It says, Meereen's trade had dwindled away to nothing since she had ended slavery.
Yeah, this really boils down to slavery. First of all, the region depends on slavery, perhaps something that ironically dates back to the Valyrian conquest of the area. Second, aside from actual slaves, she's upset the socio-economic system in the area so much that no one wants to trade with her. But she sees a solution in Xaro, Zohan, Daxos and Karth.
Dany has no ships to trade with. Remember, she turned her 3 ships into siege weapons. Again, her conquering days are coming back to haunt her rule of Meereen. So Xaro brings 13 ships, which in Dany's mind is enough to start trading with, kickstarting the Meereenese post-slavery economy. However, the Karliene are very unhappy with her stance on slavery and what she's done to the area.
Yeah, Karth can no longer acquire slaves, so its class system and culture is really in some trouble. And geography is perhaps the problem here. Karth lies beyond the Red Waste, which the Dothraki won't cross with new slaves. So Xaro and company relied on Astapor to ship slaves to them. Dany has upset the slaving supply chain, and that is very pervasive. So she now has enemies all around, and one of them turns out to be Karth.
And not only is Karth vital to her trade and shipping plans, but Dany's refusal to take the 13 ships and leave for Westeros triggers a declaration of war. To her credit, Dany decides that she can't abandon Meereen for Westeros, that the city needs to be healed first. But the result is that the Karthine ships now blockade the bay and later the Skahazadan River, and are joined by other vessels. Again, Dany dismantling her 3 ships is problematic. She can't protect her waters. No new ships can be built, because after Dany took Astapor and Yunkai and word reached Meereen, they burnt all the trees in the area because they knew she was coming. Once again, Dany's tactics for conquering, which seemed brilliant at the time, are causing grave, long-term consequences for her as a queen.
So, with no trade, this problem overlaps with yet another, food. When Dany took Meereen, there were ample food supplies. However, there's now many mouths to feed, and it's noted early on that she needs to find a new way of bolstering food supplies, as they will dwindle very quickly. And with no trade coming to the area, there's very little food actually coming in. Not only did the Old Masters burn trees to prevent siege weapons, but they ruined food and crops, perhaps with the hope that Dany's siege of their city would be broken by starvation. They saw Dany's large host of soldiers and freedmen as a weakness, something which Dany acknowledged very early on. They burnt olive groves, and Dany notes, "It takes 7 years before an olive tree begins to bear, and 30 years before it can truly be called productive."
So, Dany tries to plant trees and seeds, but as that olive quote highlighted, these things take time, something which she doesn't have a lot of. No one will trade with her. People have even stopped visiting the city due to the lack of fighting pits. The economy is dead, and Meereen is nowhere near the level of self-sustenance that it needs to thrive in the post-slavery era.
But Dany does have a plan. Whilst seeds are being planted, she finds the one race who must be very, very glad that the slave trade has been disrupted, the Lázareen. And a deal is made, so there's a brief hope of agricultural trade for Meereen. However, going back to the Carthian aggression, some of Xaro's ships sprint up the Skahazaddan River, blocking the proposed trade route with the Lázareen, which was going to be by barge.
Again, Dany's problems overlap, a huge interlinked web of dilemmas, and one which George has layered with great care to provide this sense of political realism. And we see the first effect of Dany's food problem when the Astapori are driven to her, dying from the pale mare, and she can't afford to feed them. They starve to death outside the walls, and although Dany walks amongst them, showing her motherly, empathetic side, there's simply nothing she can do. Here are 2 quotes. "These are men and women, sick and hungry and afraid. My children, I should have gone to Astapor. And then, all I did in Astapor was make 10,000 arroways."
So it's a very sad situation. Dany does have her moments of anger, but she often tries to do the right thing. She's finding it impossible to be a conqueror stroke ruler and a saviour both. It's devastating for her to see this trail of disaster in her wake. And talking about unpleasant moments for Dany, let's move on to another problem, her dragons.
Yeah, so let's remember it was Drogon who kick-started and facilitated this revolution with Dracarys. And the dragons are like weapons of mass destruction that we have in our world, with one crucial difference. These 3 atomic bombs are living and breathing and have minds of their own.
Right, so the first problem with the dragons is that now Dany's ruling Meereen, she simply has no time for them. She takes a first-hand approach to ruling, hearing the grievances of the local people, and perhaps delegates too little. This is one of many instances of her being selfless in the pursuit of a stable and peaceful city. But with that, she neglects her key military assets. She thinks, "I have left them too much to themselves, but where am I to find the time for them?"
So, the dragons are not only growing in size, but they're growing unruly. And soon Dany is presented with the bones of a child. She wonders if this is some plot, but decides the father's behavior points to this being a real claim. The only course of action she can take, then, is to chain up her dragons.
Yeah, the breaker of chains is now using chains on her own children. In a sense, Dany is now a mother to her dragons and to her people, and she had to make a choice between them. She decided that the dragons must be put out of harm's way, and this theme of shackles is very poignant. At first this seems like a good solution, however cruel to the dragons. Yet later we see the full consequences. The dragons were a great deterrent to her foes.
And with Yunkai stirring and nurturing strong alliances, Dany really needs her dragons primed and ready. This is something Brown Ben Plum recognizes. He wants to see those dragons ready for war. Because Dany refuses, he ultimately turns cloak, giving Yunkai the second sons, a loss for Meereen.
So, in protecting her Meereenese children, not only do her dragons suffer captivity, but she also loses some power. Dany does her best for this divided city, yet continues to suffer as a ruler. And so, let's look at the division of the city. Early on in Dance, Dany thinks, "To rule Meereen, I must win the Meereenese. however much I may despise them.
Dany's upset the class system, and remember, she crucified 163 masters, perhaps indiscriminately. She battles to uphold her stance on slavery, sometimes with both masters and former slaves doing what they can to reinstate old dynamics. The Sons of the Harpy are linked to the old elite, who, in turn, the Shavepates oppose. And so Meereen has these huge internal problems.
And Dany at first tries to resolve the Harpy problem by taking child hostages, or cupbearers, from the old masters, as well as decreeing a blood tax. But we see her heart in conflict with itself, her mother side and her aggressive side, when she chooses not to harm the hostages. This was a victory for her opposition in a way, but not one that we can blame her for. Yet another catch-22.
In search of peace, and an answer to almost all of the many intertwining problems we've highlighted, Dany decides to marry his Darza Lorak, despite being in love with the blue-bearded charmer Daario Naharis. It says, "My people are bleeding, dying. A queen belongs not to herself, but to the realm. Marriage or carnage, those are my choices, a wedding or a war." So here we see that, despite all the flaws of Dany's rule, she's willing to give herself to Meereen, to give everything she can. No one can deny that her idea of ruling is to put the people first.
And the wedding came with yet more compromises to her rule and ethos. Yunkai is free to slave again and sets up a human market right outside the Meereenese walls. Plus, the fighting pits were reopened, where men tear each other apart for the amusement of onlookers. Dany's dreams of a slaveless bay are further crushed under the weight of politics and complications. It seems in hindsight that she tried to bring change to the region too quickly, and that the slavist culture runs too deep, perhaps dating back thousands of years.
So, with all these problems, and the progress turned right back around into regression, it's no wonder that, when atop Drogon's back in the fighting pit, Dany shouts, "Higher!" In a sense, it's like she's running away from everything she can no longer face, which provides an opportunity for Dany to reassess and change once again, as we'll discuss.
But overall, Dany's time in Meereen as a ruler has been a disaster really, something which she seems fully aware of. But we think that, as we said earlier, it's just too simplistic to say that Dany conquers well and rules poorly. A huge portion of those Meereenese problems are rooted firmly in her conquering phase. She acted on impulse, starting a domino effect. We've previously highlighted that her spontaneity is a really great strength that she has. But in Meereen, we start to see a flip side to that, coupled with her aggressive approach.
And because of her conquering methods, she gave herself an impossible task in ruling. She couldn't be both a conqueror of slavery and a queen for peace in this part of the world. And so it's very difficult to judge Dany's ruling abilities. The issues in Meereen are so complex, and she set herself up to fail. If she'd inherited a peaceful kingdom, as many rulers have been lucky enough to have, the story might have been very different.
Yeah, we think it might, but many of Dany's poor decisions were actually catch-22s. She was bound for failure, whatever she'd done as Queen of Meereen, we think. And so here we see that you can't just divide her conquering and then her ruling. They are part of a whole, and things that seemed at one point like great conquering strategy later had devastating consequences for her rule and for her people.
And so we get to the heart of the problem. When Aegon I invaded Westeros, ruled and started a lasting dynasty, it seemed he planned the whole thing well in advance. For starters, Aegon knew Westeros. There's evidence that he visited Old Town and the Arbor and maybe Lannisport as well before the conquest. The Painted Table, that remarkable piece on Dragonstone that represented every river, town, and castle in Westeros, was made at his behest in the years before the conquest. when a proposal to wed the daughter of King Argilac Durrandon of Storm's End to Aegon's friend and possible half-brother, Orys Baratheon, was rejected with scorn, Aegon summoned all of his friends and bannermen to sit in council with him and his sister wives. For 7 days they planned their course of action before sending forth a cloud of ravens to the kings and lords of Westeros, bearing an ultimatum: submit or be conquered. And while his conquest took nearly 2 years and was not without setbacks, it was in most regards efficient and merciful whenever possible, with the end goal of having a kingdom, united and thriving, to rule.
So there you have it. Aegon is an example of a great conqueror ruler. His conquering strategy was so sound that it enabled him to come in and rule with relative peace. He made compromises such as allowing conquered kings to continue ruling their lands as vassal lords. He played the game, just as Dany did in Meereen, but his planning was much better, and so ruling was a lot easier. And Aegon used his force multiplier, his dragons, to great advantage, something Dany was at first unable, due to their youth, and later unwilling to do. In addition, Dany was new to the area. She didn't think much further than the conquering itself, and so made huge errors in the aftermath with both Astapor and Yunkai, leaving one unguarded and one, as she herself put it, untaken.
Yeah, so Dany's downfall here is that she wasn't thinking of the long view from the offset, as Aegon did. Slaver's Bay is in far worse shape than when she arrived, with very little of the positive changes actually taking root for the long term. Slavery's back, there's disease, famine, and despite thinking she made all her sacrifices for peace, there's now a huge war with the Battle of Fire. After the adrenaline rush of Dracarys, George is making us see the reality of Dany's good intentions, and it's sad to see her admirable anti-slavery stance take such a shot on the nose like this.
And given that Dany herself admits that the horrors of Astapor are rooted in her liberation, it's another blow when Xaro says Meereen is a poor city that once was rich, a hungry city that once was fat, a bloody city that once was peaceful. And Dany thinks, his accusations stung. There was too much truth in them.
For a character brimming with so much empathy and love for the common man, it's no wonder this hurts her. Meereen has brought greyness into Dany's character. She now has the complexities you'd expect from anyone who's come into power and politics. With the flaws to her ruling well and truly highlighted, her pendulum of power has swung again, this time away from her. But thinking back to what started this whole adventure, Dany needing troops and Jorah directing them to Slaver's Bay, it's interesting to think what will happen when she invades Westeros. We're all hoping that she learns from her experience in Meereen, and we'll have to see how Dany's empathetic side and her aggressive side balance out when she's ready for Westeros, another place that's already suffered enough. Dany must now embrace fire and blood if she's to one day rule Westeros, and this time let's hope she also embraces Aegon the Conqueror and has a plan, not just to conquer, but to rule.
Yeah, and speaking of ruling, we find some interesting commonalities between Dany and the ideal king Varys describes to Kevan Lannister in the Dance epilogue. He's speaking of young Griff and the qualities that have been apparently fostered in the boy to make him suitable for the throne. In addition to the usual sort of education a noble boy might be given, we're told that Aegon has lived among common people and knows how to work and feed himself, and specifically, he knows what it is like to be hungry, to be hunted, to be afraid. Aegon knows that kingship is his duty, that a king must put his people first, and live and rule for them.
But these are qualities that can be attributed to Dany as well. From her youth in the cities of Essos, to her young adulthood living with the Dothraki, and her struggles with ruling in Slaver's Bay. One thing we see in her time and again is her concern for what would be called the small folk in Westeros. And when she said, A queen belongs not to herself, but to the realm, she explicitly echoed Varys' words to Kevin. So despite the disaster of Meereen, readers can still wonder whether Dany has what it takes to be a successful leader.
And so we're going to speculate further about Dany's future, but first we want to recall her dream of change in Slavers Bay, of uniting the downtrodden slaves, people sold as she had once been. So it's time for some music from the fandom now. Here's Karliene with Dragon Queen, Mhysa.
She who walks in fire will strike down every master, break the chains around us, and we will collapse. Oh, Silver Queen, blood of dragon, Khaleesi, you who set us free, Daenerys Starborn, Dragon Queen. Us free, Daenerys Starborn, Dragon Queen.
And that was Karliene with Dragon Queen Mhysa. It's the third time we've featured Karliene's music here on Radio Westeros, and each track is great. We link to Karliene on our website if you want to check out more of her music. We do recommend it.
Yes, we do. We really love Karliene's music. So, we've done lots of analysis today and have a good feel for Dany's themes, triumphs and disappointments so far. Now it's time to look at what happened in her final chapter in Dance, and what she might face in the Winds of Winter.
Okay, so from Daznak's pit, Dany flew away on Drogon's back into the Dothraki Sea. In removing shackles from thousands of slaves, as we saw in the last segment, in a sense, she put the shackles on herself. We come back to that quote, A queen belongs to her people, not to herself. And so, in a sense, this was a flight into freedom for Dany.
Yeah, she got to leave her problems behind. However, she soon learns that not only is Meereen still gnawing away at her conscience, but that life can be very tough in the Dothraki Sea. Once a place of freedom for her, she's now struggling to meet her basic needs. Although there's clearly a big leap in her bonding with Drogon, he still does what he wants to do a lot of the time.
And so she can't get back to Meereen. She's not well, and from the description it seems she might have suffered a miscarriage too, though she herself doesn't realize it. Her hands are also burnt, dispelling any notion that she's heat or fireproof, and perhaps above all, she's hungry. At this point, the reader might wonder why she's been taken on this path, but it soon becomes clear.
Yeah, now enter the Dothraki once again. At the end of her chapter, she's eating with Drogon and is found by Khal Drogo. He was one of Khal Drogo's Khos, who took slaves and horses and left to form his own khalasar when Drogo was dying. With his blood rider Maego, he was ultimately responsible for the cruel death of Eroa, the Lazarene child who Dany had saved from rape. Near the end of game, when Dany heard this news, she told her own people, "I swear to you, these men will die screaming." And so his appearance sets up a great cliffhanger for the Winds of Winter. So let's first discuss the possibilities here.
Okay, and we're going to look at two schools of thought. I don't think we've got anything completely new to add, so let's just look at two ideas from the fandom and see if we can add some depth. The first is very simple, that Drogon and Dany will unleash some force on the Dothraki here right away. Then Dany will take over the khalasar and head to Vaes Dothrak, perhaps deciding she needs an army.
And the other idea we want to talk about is that Drogon flies away. At the start of the chapter, it's pointed out that Drogon more or less does what he wants, and every night he has a routine of flying home when it gets dark. It says, "And no matter how far the dragon flew each day, come nightfall, some instinct drew him home. His home, not mine," is what Dany thinks. And just before she sees Jaco, it's noted that the western sky had turned the colour of a blood bruise.
Right, so it sounds like dusk with the sun setting in the west. And it also says that there are burn marks all around the ground near Dany. Drogon feeds here. Drogon has come this way before, she realized, like a chain of grey islands, the marks of his hunting. So, does Drogon come here to feed, then fly off home when it gets dark? If so, this could mean bad news for Dany. She could be taken captive and taken back to Vaes Dothrak. Remember that by Dothraki traditions, Dany should have been taken to join the crones upon Drogo's death.
Yeah, and we're actually conveniently reminded of this tradition when Dany first sees a Dothraki scout. It says, if he found her there, he would kill her, rape her, or enslave her. At best, he would send her back to the crones of the Dosh Karliene, where good Khaleesi were supposed to go when their cars had died. And this would mean complete and utter disempowerment for Dany, something George might like to do to her before, well, giving her a huge Dothraki army. Drogon could show up at Vaes Dothrak later and display his powers there, for example.
And this idea has a lot more tension and complexity than Dany simply roasting Jaco and taking over his khalasar. But there's two schools of thought and more than a few offshoots from them out there. However, one thing they seem to agree upon is that Dany will end up in Vaes Dothrak, and that somehow the stallion that mounts the world prophecy will be fulfilled, something we'll leave to talk about in a future prophecy episode. But that could be the purpose of this journey into the Dothraki Sea, that she gets an army and is now ready to invade Westeros.
Yeah, George has indicated that he's been writing about the Dothraki, and also that Dany will embrace fire and blood in the new book, so lots of exciting things to come. So we can't think of any other reason for Dany meeting the Dothraki, if not to unite them to her cause. Now, let's assume she finds a way back to Meereen with a huge horde, ready to embark on the Ironborn and perhaps Volantene ships that will likely be there in Slaver's Bay.
Okay, so she has some major decisions to make. Now let's crack some pots and speculate. What is she going to do about Meereen? A huge problem for her. Well, we talked in the last episode about the Pale Mare and how devastating this disease is. With the Battle of Fire raging and dead bodies being flung around, we think that it's going to spread further and become an even bigger problem. So we were wondering, with George's note that Dany will be more aggressive after her trip to the Dothraki Sea, if she might have to torch the city.
Yeah, remember the House of the Undying? 3 fires you must light. 1 for life, 1 for death, and 1 to love. Well, Mirri's pyre could be the fire for life. And we've wondered, in a kind of crackpot way, if Meereen could be the fire for death. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is credited by some for stopping the plague. So could something similar happen here?
Quite a dark idea for Meereen's fate there.
Yes, it's a bit too dark for some people, I think.
Well, I mean, she could always move the people over to Yunkai if that city's defeated in the Battle of Fire. And another decision Dany might have to make is if she's to marry Victarion Greyjoy. He might be as dumb as a stump, but he has a fleet, and if he's still around, she just might have to listen to his proposition if Hizdar's out of the picture.
Yeah, that sounds like the worst nightmare for Dany fans. It's a horrible matchup. But then again, on the other side of the coin, how often do we see nice pairings?
Right.
With dragons, the Hellhorn, and Dany presumably needing to get to Westeros in double time, it will be really interesting to see what happens if those two characters meet. And these are just some of the intriguing storylines we're looking forward to seeing unfolding in the Winds of Winter.
So, if she's going to embrace fire and blood, Dany needs to become ruthless, selfish, and go for the jugular. Whatever happens to her on the Dothraki Sea, it seems she's going to realize all of this is necessary if she's going to conquer Westeros. As Quaithe says to her, perhaps communicating through a glass candle, remember who you are, Daenerys. And as we know, Daenerys Targaryen is the last dragon, the seed of Aegon the Conqueror.
And Dany has shown large amounts of both empathy and destruction in her story so far. She's risen from timid commodity to mother of dragons, Mhysa to slaves, and queen to Meereen. She's also had a pendulum of power swinging right through her arc. Whether you appreciate Dany or not, I think it's really fair to say that she can create excitement to match any character in this series. And we really look forward to seeing how she fares and how her pendulum swings in the Winds of Winter.
And thanks for listening to our look at Daenerys Targaryen. Next time we'll be taking a very close look at the Lion of the West, Tywin Lannister, and we hope you come back for that. Now, to give credit where credit is due, thanks to 9 Inch Nails for allowing us to use and remix elements of their music. Thanks to Kevin MacLeod. Visit Incompetech.com for royalty-free music. We used Constance, Movement Proposition, Colorless Aura, Decline, and Balzan Groove today. See our licensing page on our website or on the MP3 tag for further details. Thanks to Karliene for her song Dragon Queen Mhysa, and to the History of Westeros podcast for their advert. Finally, thanks to George R.R. Martin for The World of A Song of Ice and Fire. So, we hope you've enjoyed. Visit RadioWesteros.com for access to all our podcasts, and come back next time for some Tywin. Bye for now.